I never meant to become the person who checks the delivery van 3 times before opening a door. That shift came slow, a knot in the chest that lives on cold nights, the habit of keeping one hand on my wallet, the way a receipt makes me pause now, as if paper could anchor me back to a moment when things were ordinary. This is how it started. Small choices, sudden violence, the long tail of what you never expected to pay for a discount. If this is a video for you, before you watch the whole thing, please like, subscribe, and tell someone you trust about the safety tips in the description. These stories are hard, but sharing them might keep one person safer. I went for a jacket. It was one line and one breathless push that I still replay. The store smelled of heated air and perfume, someone's cheap cologne tangled with the metallic tang of new hangers. Black Friday had turned the mall into a river of people. I had arrived early because my roommate needed a jacket for a job interview, and I'd promised to be quick. That promise felt like armor until the doors opened. The crowd was a tide, slow and then sudden. Plastic shopping bags slapped my calves. A man near me mouthed, "Move," like a command rather than a request. We all read the signs the same way: scarcity, speed, prize. When the racks were flung open, it wasn't orderly, it was a collapse. Arms reached like branches. Someone shoved against my ribs, and I felt air leave my lungs in a soft animal sound. I grabbed a coat without looking because someone's hand was in front of my face, and the impulse to survive is louder than thought. Then the slide began. A woman fell, her heel caught in the metal base of a display, and it was like a domino. Bodies bending, people stepping over her, someone's shoulder pressed into my throat. Everything compressed. I could hear the muffled cadence of shoes on tile, and an infant somewhere screaming a high, thin sound that I can still hear when buses pass at night. The floor felt like it was moving beneath me, not the ground, but the pressure of living bodies shifting. I remember thinking that the emergency exit sign glowed over the chaos like a promise nobody could reach. A man beside me kept saying, "Let go of my sleeve," and later I realized he wasn't saying it to me, but to the person clinging to him. Security appeared as 3 figures pushing through, but their radios were small against the tide. Someone screamed that they couldn't breathe. I threw my coat over my shoulder and shoved toward an aisle that opened like a gutter. A child's sneaker dangled where they'd been trampled, one white toe chipped with dirt. Outside, the cold hit me like revelation. We spilled out into the parking lot, and the people who had been part of the movement untangled into individual bodies. Eyes stunned, receipts crumpled, a torn jacket laying on the asphalt like a small flag. The store later said there'd been injuries, a few taken to the hospital. The news called it a rush. I called my roommate with hands that trembled and said, "I can't, don't come." I still look for the receipt from that purchase months later, partly for refund, partly to prove I'd been there, to mark the page where my life tilted. Afterward, the lesson was practical and gut level. Never go alone if you can help it. Map where exits are when you walk into any large store. If you feel the tide move, drop low and protect your chest. I started carrying a small flashlight in my purse and checking the layout near doors. I learned to spot where crowds bottleneck and avoid it. The jacket lost its glitter. It went into the back of my closet with the tag still on, a small monument to guilt. They told us to shop online next time. I learned that sometimes the safest choice is to walk away from a deal. The listing for the TV looked perfect. The picture was clear, the price almost absurd. I was trying to furnish a spare room and thought I'd found a score. The seller's profile had a few glowing reviews. The message thread felt casual and polite. When I went to meet him in a parking lot outside a grocery store, the air had that diesel bread bag warmth of late November. He was early, a man with a plain hoodie, carrying the box like it had been a burden he wanted to get rid of. We exchanged a few lines. Cash? Yeah, cash. And he said he'd be happy to help me load it into my car. Something about the box felt light. I didn't weigh it. I was relieved it went into my trunk easily. When I closed the lid, he asked if I'd mind driving a few blocks to a better lit place so he could check a payment on his phone. I should have said no, but gratitude covers a lot of warnings. I nodded, and he asked for the receipt space in my glove compartment because he said he'd misplaced his own. I handed him the paper. He tucked it into his hoodie pocket, and then, with a soft motion, reached toward my passenger seat. The hand that went into the glove compartment didn't come back with a smile. It came with an armful of my mail, a stack of envelopes I hadn't bothered to gather, my bank letters, a half-hidden card with my name on it. He said, "Sorry," like a small thing, and then the world tilted. We were in a busy strip, traffic humming, and he kept talking, words meant to cushion the theft. My kid needs a new battery. I'm on my way to work. I remember the smell of cigarette smoke when the neighbor leaned out of his pickup and watched us argue. His silhouette was a backdrop I would later haunt me. I slammed the trunk and told him to drop my mail. He smiled with a kind of practiced calm, then moved quick, too quick, and before I could lock my door, he was gone down the sidewalk with the letters tucked like a trophy. I called the bank. The number on the back of my card was still warm in my pocket. I canceled cards, put fraud alerts on my accounts. I walked the parking lot under the sodium lights, looking for a hoodie and the shape of a footprint. The police said they'd seen similar scams. Sellers who asked to see receipts as a way to steal identifying information. Short walks to better lighting that end with your wallet lighter. They told me to file a report and to monitor my credit. That took weeks, and each small alert on my phone made my chest tighten like knots being pulled. The practical part settled into muscle memory. Never hand over a receipt to someone you don't know. Meet sellers in public with cameras or at designated safe exchange zones. And insist on inspecting items before handing over cash. I learned to bring a friend to transactions and to trust the systems. Use official pickup points or an app's protected payment method rather than cash. I learned to hide my mail until I could bring it inside. The TV stayed mediocre, with a faint rattle that I'd noticed but pretended not to. The theft cost me more than money. It cost a sense of ease when strangers are nearby. I was working the overnight shift at a warehouse that did installations for new appliances. The job paid enough to cover rent and student loans. It was honest work. That December night, they scheduled me to do a solo delivery in a quiet cul-de-sac. The house smelled like cinnamon when I knocked. Holiday candles, someone baking. A young woman answered in a sweater with a cat on the front and said, "Perfect timing." She signed on the tablet with fumbling fingers and led me inside, apologizing for the mess. The apartment was small, a Christmas tree in the corner, and the light was soft. She kept talking, the words like warm tea. "If you need anything, the heater's not great, sorry." She offered coffee. I should have kept the package in the doorway, but a homeowner's kindness was a lure. One thing led to another. She asked where I'd come from. We joked about traffic. And when she offered me a glass as a thanks, I had that moment where a person's politeness overrides the training. I sipped and felt something sharp at the edge of my mouth, a bitter tang. My head fogged for a breath. I woke up on the couch with my phone buzzing somewhere in the bedroom. The kettle was whistling as if nothing had happened. A drawer was open. A ring box that had been on the coffee table was gone. The woman was there, eyes wide and scared. "I'm so sorry," she said, and it was a strange, small groan of regret. She'd had a fake installer in once before, she admitted, someone posing as a courier who checked the furnace and left. Her voice was thin when she confessed she'd handed him cash because he said he needed it for parts. I left the apartment with a head full of shards, reporting what I could. The police took statements. The company said they'd look into the contractor list. The truth is, we built trust on the script of service. Uniforms, branded vans, the polite catchphrase of someone helping you. Criminals know this grammar. They use a handshake to rewrite a room. After that, my back of the neck learned to scan for lanyards, for patches, for officialness. If I'm receiving a technician now, I ask to see ID, and then I call the company from my phone to confirm the appointment. I don't invite anyone in until I've verified that the job was scheduled. I learned to prefer curbside drop-off for appliances and to insist that installers bring a pre-printed work order I can check against my confirmation email. If something smells off, if the uniform looks cheap, if the van doesn't have the logo I saw in the confirmation, I cancel. They told me the stolen ring was rare. I told them it didn't matter. It had been a promise meant to stay under a couch, not carried away. My son wanted one small thing for the holidays, a set of headphones that smelled of new plastic. I woke up early and waited in the cold with other parents and dreamers. The store's door opened and everyone surged like the sea, eager, polite, hungry. A man elbowed past me and groaned, "I need to get the last pair," as if it were a sentence of fact. I pressed on. I felt fingers brush my coat and then tug at my bag. I turned, and a woman in a thick parka had zipped her hand into my tote and pulled free a folded piece of paper, my child's permission slip, my grocery list, my check stub. "Hey," I said, and her eyes met mine just long enough for me to register a panic that wasn't mine. She muttered, "Sorry," like a reflex, and then another hand reached in. There was a rhythm, a group moving as one, small thefts in a tide. When I pushed back, someone laughed, low and mean. A man in a hoodie grabbed at my wrist hard enough to bruise. I still have the mark. I didn't want to make a scene. The saleswoman's voice decided the moment. "Excuse me, folks, please step back." And the crowd surged forward again. I should have called security, but the person in me who wanted to keep the peace swallowed the urge. Later at home, when I finally read my bank statement, I found a charge I hadn't made. My cards had been skimmed at a checkout, small amounts at a time, like water through a crack. The investigation felt like bureaucracy hugging my anger. The card company sent a form, a number, a passive apology. I had to file disputes and wait. I replaced cards, changed passwords, and started using contactless pay whenever possible. I learned to cover PIN pads, to refuse third-party card readers at checkout, and to watch for devices stuck onto ATMs or registers that looked like extra plastic. I learned to pocket my receipts immediately and to check my statements weekly. My son opened his headphones with sticky fingers and smiled as if the whole day hadn't been a ledger. I kept my hand on his shoulder longer that night than I used to, feeling the tremor under the skin that knows the world is not as safe as you thought. I started to carry a small receipt from that day, folded in my wallet, not to prove anything, but to remember the hunched woman's apology that wasn't remorse. We rented a storage unit to hold a batch of extra holiday inventory for the boutique I ran. We were small. The rent owed on the space was a line item that kept me awake. One night, I parked under a pale lamp and carried in boxes, the smell of cardboard and the faint perfume of the shop, leather cleaner, citrus polish. A van idled as I turned the key of the lock, and a man in a high-vis vest said, "Wrong lane, mate," like an apology and an instruction together. He had a clipboard and a smile. I let him pass by as he briskly walked to the next door, and when I turned back, my lock was broken. The metal jaw bent like it was hurt. Inside, the boxes were slashed open, not neatly, but with impatience. A jacket of mine, the display piece with the bright tag, was gone. The tag lay on the concrete like a small accusation. I called the police, called the insurer, and then stared at the rent ledger like a guilty notice. Someone else had the jacket. Maybe she'd sold it in some dark corner. Maybe it was a stolen trophy. The loss was more than stock. It was reputation, the weight of explaining to customers that we'd been robbed. After that theft, I changed the locks and put a camera that I could check on from my phone. I registered serial numbers, kept receipts and invoices in a separate locked briefcase, and started photographing every item I brought into storage with a time-stamped app. I trained myself to mark the tags with a subtle stitch that only I would recognize. I learned that visible security, good lighting, cameras, reinforced locks, deters some thieves, though not all. The aftermath was heavy. Increased insurance premiums, a sense of violation, customers who asked if the coats were authentic. I kept the torn jacket tag pinned in my office, a small ritual to remember that trust is often the cheapest currency. Someone knocked on my door late, all soft steps and apologies. It was a delivery driver with a clipboard and an unfamiliar logo. He said he had the package I'd been waiting for and asked if I could sign inside because it was raining. I had a latch on my door, a small metal catch that used to make me safe. I opened it a crack and asked for ID. He held up a card that looked official, a laminated rectangle with a photo and a name. I examined it the way you do when you want to be kind without being gullible. It seemed fine. He smiled and said, "Quick, please, it's only a meter inside." My stomach dropped. There had been stories, staged deliveries that let strangers into kitchens, into bedrooms, into the private geography of a home. I almost closed the door, the latch a weight in my hand. Instead, I asked him to sign on the porch. He hesitated, and then his eyes slid to the latch with a quickness that made me lose my breath. I closed the door and slid the bolt. He cursed under his breath, like a child, a small sound of annoyance. Later that night, I sat with a cup of tea and imagined him moving on, finding another house where the latch was loose. I learned then to check the app confirmation number, to call the courier company on my phone using the number listed on the official site, and to insist on a signature at the door instead of inviting anyone in. If someone claims to be a worker, I learned to ask the dispatcher to call me while I stand at the door so the person can't simply bluff their way past. I also started to keep a flashlight near the latch and to text a neighbor if I expected a delivery after dark. The latch became a ritual of resistance. I slide it open, I check the ID through the peephole, I step back until I can verify. Small things, but they felt like the architecture of safety. I was in line for a cashierless store when something happened that made my hands go cold. The system was supposed to be seamless. Grab, pay, go. The scanner overhead read the items, and the exit gate chimed. But a group near the door surged forward and began to shove. I'd seen crowding before, but this had a different rhythm. Slick, practiced. People moved like cogs. Small hands snatching items from baskets, others distracting with questions. A young man blocked my view and asked, "Could you hold the door?" He smiled, and the man behind him laughed softly. The door opened, and suddenly there were fewer items on the shelves and more people moving out with bags hidden in jackets. I reached across to grab a package I'd picked and felt a hand drop something onto my arm. One of those little thefts that are misdirection. When I noticed, a woman who'd been near the front tried to push past me and brush off a fall. Her wig came loose and she swore. Security came, but the law says property must be clearly proven in your hands before you can be accused. People were arrested later, but many were not. The thick thing of injustice stayed like frost. After that, I stopped assuming technology equals safety. I bag items in a way that makes them visible to my own hands. I keep my eyes up. I wait for the crowd to break rather than pushing into the swell. I learned to be the kind of shopper who gives up an item rather than losing myself in a press of bodies. If I see a move that looks coordinated, people making space for each other with practiced gestures, I back out. It seems like small cowardice, but it saved me from being squeezed into decisions I didn't want to make. The jacket I once bought on impulse still hangs in my closet with a faint smear on the sleeve, a memory of a night when I clung to a bargain and almost lost something else. I fold the receipt into my wallet, and sometimes, when I'm tired, I take it out and look at the date like a talisman. A year later, the city announced a sting. They'd focused on parking lots and meetups, set up safe exchange locations, and posted officers at high-risk sites. They recovered a few items and made several arrests. But the arrests never bring back the sense of invulnerability. They bring back the receipt of what happened. Paperwork, a photo, a number to remember. When Black Friday comes around now, I check my routes. I plan to meet friends in well-lit areas if we have to go, and I weigh the cost of a deal against the price of my peace. I will still buy gifts, but I do it with a ledger. Safety first, then savings. I could write 9 different endings for these stories, but the pattern is the same. They start with a need, warmth, a gift, a bargain, and they end with a tightened chest. The lessons are practical. Verify IDs through official channels. Use protected payment methods. Meet buyers and sellers in public. Check your mail and bank statements regularly. Keep emergency exits clear. And if you feel the crowd move, protect your chest and head and try to get low. Keep copies of receipts and photograph serial numbers. These are not guarantees, they are small defenses. I don't want to live in fear, but I have learned that caution is a muscle you build with small, consistent actions. Sometimes I dream about the emergency exit sign glowing above a calm doorway. Other nights, I wake up thinking about a torn jacket tag lying in the parking lot. The symbols linger because they are simple. Receipts, jackets, latches, objects that once meant convenience and now stand for lessons I wish I had not needed. If you take anything from this, let it be that a moment of hesitation can change everything. Ask for ID, verify with an official number. Don't hand over mail, receipts, or cards to strangers. Meet in daylight or at designated safe zones. Keep a light by your door and a friend on speed dial. Those small rituals are cheap compared to the cost of recovery. I'm not finished telling every story I carry. There are more nights, more small violences, more quiet repairs that people make in their lives. But I will stop here for now, and I'll begin again, because the next story is waiting, and the next lesson is still being learned. The next story begins with a neighbor's knock. It was late afternoon, and the light had that thin, cautious quality of late October. Mrs. Alvarez had lived 2 doors down for as long as I'd lived here. Her windows always trimmed with little plants, the kind that survived on stubbornness rather than water. And she knocked with the careful rhythm of someone used to surprising you into attention. She stood on my stoop holding an empty box and a look that tried to be embarrassed and furious at once. "My delivery never arrived," she said without preamble. "They left a notice. I waited. Then the tracking said delivered. It's not here." We walked the route the driver would have taken, the path from the street through a narrow cut between two hedges, the porch with the rickety railing. There, in a dip beside the downspout, lay the torn corner of a packing slip. No package, no footprints in the mulch, just that small scrap of paper and the sense that someone had passed through while time kept pretending nothing had changed. She filed a claim that night because there are forms and web portals and phone trees that comfort you by giving you something to press. The claim required serial numbers, proof of purchase, a copy of the notice. She had the receipt folded into a paperback recipe book. She had the notice from the mail slot. She did not have the package. She called the carrier and was placed on hold long enough to convince herself she'd been abandoned by an institution designed to be helpful. This is how petty injustice accumulates. A missing box, a call that goes nowhere, a clerical unable to verify that becomes an invisible tax. Mrs. Alvarez told me she'd replaced the missing kettle with a less fancy model and then, 2 weeks later, found the same model listed on a resale app under a nearby user's name. Someone's picture of a kettle with a chipped spout was exactly like the box she'd received notice for. It felt like a scratch across a memory. She called the number on the app and it went to a voicemail with half a name. She reported it. The platform removed the listing. The user vanished. The kettle did not return. When people speak of theft, they often imagine dramatic confrontations, shouts, police lights, the humiliation of handcuffs. But much of what we live through is smaller. The paper-scratched receipts, the quiet erasure of a plan, the slow, grinding work of proving something that should be obvious. We spend hours on hold to be told we do not have a right to be believed until the evidence is perfect. And the evidence is rarely perfect in the spaces where systems were designed for speed rather than for justice. A friend whose name I will protect told me about the networked way small crimes become expertise. He fixes phones and laptops in the back of a pawn shop. People drop off devices with screens smashed or batteries swollen and say they found them by the curb or inherited them from a neighbor. He can tell by a serial number if a device has been reported stolen, and sometimes he calls the police because the story doesn't add up. Once, while checking a phone, he found a string of messages from a group chat-style arrangement, coordinates, time windows, a shorthand that looked like choreography. The police took that evidence more seriously when it matched similar reports, but by then, the patterns felt older than the goodwill of any one officer. There are small communities, neighbors, shopkeepers, the clerk at the corner bodega who create makeshift defenses. They leave notes on porches for people who have been taken in by a scam. They text each other when a new method appears. They trade photos of suspicious vehicles. These networks are pragmatic and messy. They do not carry the weight of formal institutions, but they do the thing institutions sometimes fail to do. They watch, they warn, and they exchange the human currency of attention. I learned, reluctantly, to be part of that exchange. When a woman down the block reported a stranger who mimicked being a municipal inspector, I made a spreadsheet. Ridiculous, perhaps, but better than nothing. Of phone numbers, tags, and the names that the scammers used. Spreadsheets feel like armor in a world where so much of what protects you is ephemeral. A remembered face, a name verified by an old friend, a receipt held between two fingers like proof of identity. There is a peculiar exhaustion to being vigilant all the time. It is not dramatic, it is slow. I found myself questioning the motives of people who approached me in aisles or strategies used by sellers on online marketplaces. My first instinct when someone suggested a deal would be to ask for photos of serial numbers, the original box, a proof of purchase. Friends laughed. "You're turning into a detective," they said. But there is tenderness in a friend who knows how quickly an identity can be constructed and remolded. Identity theft, perhaps more than shoplifting, gnaws at you because it eats the idea of who you are in practical terms. A stolen social security number or bank login does not just cost money, it complicates life. Applications rejected, credit scored incorrectly, a mortgage application delayed by a phantom debt. A colleague of mine spent months undoing a mess that started with a call from someone claiming to be from his bank. They knew the last 4 digits of his account, made him panic, and tricked him into authorizing a transfer. He lost money and sleep. He learned to change passwords the day after choosing new ones, to add 2-factor authentication, to stare at every email with suspicion. Later, once his accounts were restored, he was left with the aftertaste of doubt, a sense that his own name could be reshaped and used against him. Recovery is bureaucratic patience. It is hours on the phone, forms requested in triplicate, visits to offices where people ask you to prove something you know is true to your bones, that you are who you say you are. The process is designed to be navigable only if you have time, energy, and the ability to narrate yourself coherently. Not everyone does. That is part of why predatory schemes target the vulnerable. They are less likely to have the resources to fight back. There are, however, moments of small triumph that do not require courts or long hearings. A woman from my block recovered an old camera when a kid pawned it for a fraction of its worth. She spent a Saturday walking into every shop in the neighborhood with a photo of the lens and serial number. Someone recognized it, an older pawnbroker who'd worked in the business long enough to keep a ledger in his head. He called the kid, negotiated until the camera was returned, and charged no fee. The camera was battered, but it was hers again. That afternoon, she baked a pie and brought it to the shop as thanks. The exchange was quieter than a warrant. It felt more human. The city sting I mentioned earlier, parking lot surveillance, marked safe exchange zones, helped some people and made others complacent. It created a language of official places and safe times, but criminals adapt. When one route closes, another opens. Our rituals, then, must be less about certainty than about resilience. If one method fails, we have others to fall back on. Resilience is mundane. It is backups and photos and habits. It is keeping hard copies of receipts in a fireproof box, but also knowing that a fireproof box does no good if you never catalog what is inside it. It is teaching an elderly neighbor how to recognize phishing emails by the way their language scrambles and the typos that appear when the scammer is trying too hard. It is asking for ID from a stranger at the door, even if it feels awkward, because awkwardness is cheap compared to the cost of being wrong. There is a social choreography that has emerged. When we sell used things, we prefer cashless exchanges at public places. When we buy online, we favor sellers who show original packaging and impose verifications. When someone is anxious about an item, we ask questions that feel intrusive until the other person relaxes because they are relieved someone cares. We build trust through procedures that feel formal but are simply neighborliness dressed in paperwork. A younger cousin came to visit last winter carrying a guitar he'd bought at what he described as a too-good-to-be-true price. It was a neat, glossy instrument with a chip on the headstock and a case locked with a zipper that didn't match. He beamed at the bargain and expected high fives. I asked for the serial number. He didn't have it. I asked for the original listing and the contact. He had screenshots, but the seller's account had been suspended. The guitar sounded fine. It felt heavy and warm in his hands. I called a colleague who consults with a community of musicians and instrument sellers. She ran the make and model through a database and, within an hour, told us that the guitar had been reported by a school teacher 3 months earlier. We arranged to meet the teacher at a neutral cafe. He showed us the repair receipt and a photo of a unique scratch. The guitar was his. My cousin handed it back without ceremony, mortified and sheepish and wiser. The teacher did not press charges. He had a different view, one that struck me at dinner later. I taught him guitar, he said. If he needed it to start learning again, I'd rather have it in his hands than in a fence's. He had that rare combination of practicality and grace. He also knew there were other ways to build a life beyond possessions. A heater can be replaced. A trust cannot always be rebuilt. It is after stories like these that I find myself thinking about the language we use for harm. We tend to classify things as losses or violations, and then move on to the mechanics of replacement. But the human cost is not always monetary. Shame is a currency that thieves often collect. People feel foolish admitting they were fooled, and so they remain silent. That silence is a wound because it allows schemes to persist unchallenged. When someone tells the truth, "I was scammed," it becomes a public act of repair. So I have learned to listen without judgment. When someone confesses that they clicked the link or handed over the card, I ask about next steps. Have you called the bank? Have you frozen accounts? Have you told your credit bureau? I offer to sit on the call if they want. Often they say yes. Sometimes just having another person in the room reduces the tremor in their voice. Practical help is also a kind of grace. There are cultural frictions to navigate. Some communities distrust institutions due to long histories of neglect or discrimination. Asking someone to file police reports or lodge claims can be an act of violence if that institution has not served them well before. In those communities, our networks, church groups, neighborhood associations, local businesses become the first responders for dignity. They lobby a courier company when complicit drivers leave packages in the open. They gather evidence when a pattern of theft appears. The work is grassroots and often unglamorous, but it stitches neighborhoods together. Once, in the rain, I accompanied a woman to the post office after she believed her identity had been used to open a line of credit in her name. We sat in a cramped office with a ventilation system that coughed at us like an old man clearing his throat. The clerk asked for forms, then for more forms. At one point, the woman began to cry, not from the chill or the paperwork, but from fatigue. She had been saying no to people for months. No to false bills, no to collectors, no to friends who suggested it was her fault. I held her hand while she filled out a declaration. We left with copies and a promise to follow up. 3 months later, she had a letter saying the accounts were closed. The relief that settled over her face was almost visible, an easing like the unfastening of a corset. She had paid more than the direct cost. She had paid in hours, in dignity and worry. Recovery is not a single event. It is a slow reclamation. There are also stories of recovery that are resourceful in ways institutions are not. A group of parents at an elementary school set up a safe drop at the back of the playground where Facebook Marketplace exchanges could happen with other parents during pickup. They kept a folding table and a jar of hand sanitizer, and for a while, it became a slow market of bargains made safer by the presence of adults with eyes on them. It was not perfect, but it reduced the anxiety of single parents meeting strangers at dusk. And then there are the small, private rituals people adopt to live alongside trauma. The neighbor with the stolen kettle started leaving a ceramic bell on her porch. If she was expecting a delivery, she'd ring it and step outside to watch the walk. Another friend began threading serial numbers into a notebook that she locked in her glove compartment. My own ritual is less ornamental. I keep a photo album on my phone of receipts and device serial numbers indexed by year. It is a small, dull archive, but the day I needed it, it felt like a map home. What none of these rituals can do is make the world perfectly safe. They are stopgaps. They are muscles we develop so we can move through the city without carrying panic in our limbs. Occasionally, they work brilliantly. A tracked package returned, a bogus listing taken down, a scammer identified. More often, they slow the damage, mitigate the harm just enough for people to breathe. The city's stings and the neighborhood's watches do something else. They reveal who is willing to look up from their routine. There is a moral economy in vigilance. Some of us give a little time and knowledge. Others offer money or legal expertise. The sum of these contributions is not a guarantee of justice, but it is a community's attempt to take responsibility for one another. I keep thinking about the jacket in my closet, the smear on the sleeve like a punctuation mark in a sentence I wish I had never written. It is a reminder that small decisions accumulate into patterns. A swiped bracelet, a clever email, a coordinated doorway, each is a cut that teaches you how to move differently. Last week, in a grocery store 2 blocks away, I felt that old press of bodies again. Not the slick, orchestrated crowd I'd described before, but a gentler nudge of someone trying to reach for a high shelf. I watched. A woman in a blue coat reached up and asked the clerk for an item. As the clerk turned, a teenager in a gray hoodie moved with the gap and slipped 2 small packages into his jacket. I moved forward because the muscle of intervention had been built. I asked loudly, "Did you see that?" The teenager froze, and something in his face shifted. Embarrassment, perhaps, or surprise at being called out in public. He walked away. The packages were small and cheap. The loss would have been bearable to the store, but not to a person who might have needed those items. The clerk thanked me and said under his breath, "Good, people need to pay attention." He restocked the shelf and watched the doorway like someone guarding a fragile thing. I do not want to romanticize these moments. Calling someone out can escalate. There are smarter ways to intervene. Alert the staff, position yourself between the exit and the person, keep the attention low and factual. Ways that protect dignity while stopping harm. But I also know that sometimes a hesitant voice in the aisle can interrupt a pattern. Patterns are fragile. They react to attention as if attention were light. As I walked home, I thought about the cumulative effect of small acts. A clerk watching a teen, a neighbor sharing a screenshot, a teacher reclaiming an instrument. Each one of these acts is tiny and fragile, and collectively they create a culture that says theft and deceit are not invisible. They do not fix everything, but they make it harder to be unscrupulous. There is a story I have not told yet, the one that waits like a closed book on my kitchen table. It involves a winter evening and a bench by the river and a decision that was less about theft and more about the moral cost of pretending not to see. I have been circling that story, arranging it like a cautious plan on paper. It will make its way into this ledger of small violences and quiet repairs. For now, I fold the receipt back into my wallet, check the sleeve of the jacket to see if the smear has faded, and make a list of the things to do tomorrow. Update passwords, drop a note to Mrs. Alvarez to check if the kettle listing ever reappears, and call the pawn shop to see if any unusual guitars have come through. The ledger of vigilance is a long one, and I walk with it like a companion. I want to live without being afraid. I also want to be capable of standing in a doorway and asking a simple question, or sitting with someone as they straighten out the tangle of their identity. These are not heroic acts. They are the ordinary labor of looking after one another. Outside, the city hums with its usual indecipherable noises, the distant wail of a siren, a dog barking, the soft patter of a rain that has begun without ceremony. I cross the street and a woman struggles with grocery bags. I take one without asking. She thanks me with a surprised smile that feels like an old ally. It is a small exchange, but in a ledger of small repairs, it goes down as a credit. There are more stories to tell. There will be nights of sharper lessons and mornings of quiet victories. For now, the rules remain the same. Keep receipts, ask questions, trust cautiously, and offer help when you can. I fold my hands for a moment over the wallet that still bears the receipt talisman, and then tuck it away. The ledger is not closed. I look up and, across the street, someone in a blue coat catches my eye. He nods, the kind of nod that says he recognizes the work as well. Then, as if on cue, a young man at the corner makes a motion with his fingers, an easy, practiced signal, and a small group around him rearranges, opening a path that looks, to an untrained observer, like the bustle of daily life. The movement is subtle, a practiced choreography, but every instinct I have built over the last years hums like a wire. I turn my feet toward the bus stop and follow at a distance, because curiosity is not only a vice, it is a tool. The city is full of lessons, and sometimes lessons arrive wrapped in ordinary clothes. They move with a practiced economy, a shoulder that blocks a view, a hand that lingers near a pocket, a laugh that is timed to split attention. From a block away, I can read the choreography like a map. When they pause beneath the awning of a shuttered cafe, the leader, thin, quick-eyed, tilts his chin and watches the street. Two others fan out, blending into a bus shelter, fumbling with a phone as if they were waiting for a ride. It is the small, rehearsed theater of those who have done this long enough to make it look accidental. I slow. There is always a margin for error. A child pushing a stroller, a distracted tourist, an old woman with a cane. Those margins are the thing the choreography relies on. I think of the clerk restocking the shelf, of the teen frozen by my question, and I think too of the ledger that sits on my kitchen table, the one I haven't closed. The ledger does not tally only the things I do, it keeps a record of the times I have looked away. That is the story waiting on my table, the winter evening and the bench by the river. The night comes to me now with a cold clarity, as if the breath of that air still hangs in my lungs. It was a Tuesday, or a Tuesday that felt like one. Snow had been patient all day, thin and precise, making the promenades silver. The city had gone quieter sooner than it should, as if the weather suggested discretion. I had meant to walk home, to unspool the day in a way that did not require company. Instead, I found myself scaling the river path until the city's clamor was a distant thread, and the river moved dark and glacial under the lamplight. On the bench that night, a man sat with his coat buttoned to his throat and a hat pulled low. He had a grocery bag at his feet, the rim leaking a loaf of bread that looked like it had been bought at discount. I remember the smell of yeast in the wind, the hollow way his shoulders trembled when he exhaled. A woman came up the path, a flash of color against the white. She stopped short when she saw him, and then, more slowly, sat at the other end of the bench as if the distance were required by some etiquette. They did not speak for a long time. Then a younger figure, neat coat and easy confidence, rounded the bend and paused, smiling like a knowing person. He asked for the time, leaned into conversation, and then began to talk to the man on the bench with the kind of charm that reads to some people as safety. I watched because I could not watch. It is a dangerous claim that the act of looking is moral. Looking can be voyeurism. Looking can be surveillance. That night, the young man did something small and practiced. He tapped the grocery bag with his toe, as if accidentally, and then reached as though to steady it. When he straightened, he had a folded bill in his hand. The man on the bench blinked and smiled in a way that might have been gratitude. The young man walked on. Later that week, I learned the man on the bench had lost his wallet, his bus pass. A charity volunteer found him looking for somewhere to sleep. The neat young man had not given the folded bill away. He had lifted the old man's purse the way someone might lift a napkin, without flourish. I told myself it was coincidence until the pattern hardened into a fact. The ledger at home acquired an entry. The night on the river, page marked with a faint smear where a coffee had spilled across a column of names. I told myself many things to keep the ledger from growing heavy. I told myself that intervention might have caused violence, that it might have been dangerous for the man on the bench if I had spoken up. I told myself I had no right to interfere into an exchange I did not fully understand. These were not untrue. They were, however, inadequate. The truth that stayed with me was simpler and more corrosive. By pretending not to see, I preserved my own safety and paid with a small, steady grief. It is not the same as guilt, which demands redress. It is a quieter, more persistent thing that makes you alter the shape of your life, sitting straighter, watching longer, learning when to speak. That night I did not add money to the old man's bag. I did not make the neat young man feel noticed. I thumbed a cigarette I did not smoke and walked on. And later I found I had learned a language of what it costs to remain a bystander. For months afterward, I kept my eyes soft but present, practiced phrases I could use without accusation, learned how to place myself where I might be useful. Beside a doorway, in sight of an exit, a calm voice ready to name what I had seen without magnifying it. The ledger changed its balance. Debits were still there, but credits began to appear, small daily payments towards something like repair. Back under the awning, the group moves again, a ripple of bodies adjusting to an opportunity. A man with a newspaper shifts, his bag open on a bench. The leader's hand is already learning the seam. I can cross the street and be merely a passerby. I can call the dispatch number on my phone and let someone else become responsible. Or I can step into the gap between the bench and the exit and say nothing more than what I have learned to say. Low, factual, non-accusatory. I find my feet choosing for me. The ledger is not a ledger if it never travels with you into the city. You keep records to act upon them. The snow has become a fine mist again, catching on my eyelashes. The young man in the blue coat notices me moving. He nods in that same way, as if he and I speak the same language of attention. The leader looks up, and for a moment his eyes meet mine. It is the smallest exchange, acknowledgement without words, and then the choreography resumes. I step from the curb.